Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. So, this question has sometimes plagued the minds of people in the Legend of Spyro community, and it's something that has been delved into a little bit. A lot of people have a few reasons why they come up with their own conclusion, but today we're going to try to come up with our own. We're going to be delving into the question, what a generation actually means in the Legend of Spyro. For those who don't know, there is some confusion on what a generation is because in the Legend of Spyro there is a prophecy that speaks of a purple dragon, an individual meant to bring upon a new age, and one that only comes once every 10 generations. And this all comes from a character known as Ignitus, who told Spyro that this is what the prophecy says. However, how long these generations are is not specified, so that led to a few assumptions by fans. Usually what is accepted is that these 10 generations add up to 1,000 years, meaning that each generation would last 100 years. But for some, they don't quite accept that. I'll show you why. First, let's go into what a generation is, and then we'll actually use that as a base. The definition is, quote, the average interval of time between the birth of the parents and the birth of their offspring, end quote. For humans, this is around 20 to 30 years from what I've found. If you multiply it by 10, just doing simple math, that means you get 200 to 300 years. Sometimes for some families it stretches out to 400 years. If you take this to the dragons, and this is how I got the idea that 1,000 years would mean 100 generations per generation, and this is where I got that 100 years would equal to 1 generation. You multiply 100 times 10, then what do you get? 1,000. Anyway, let's move on, because I don't want to make this a math class. Now we have to figure out with our own evidence how long this would be for dragons, and this is where the concept of the Year of the Dragon might be brought up. So, I'll say it here, there is an event called the Year of the Dragon, but this was in the original trilogy. In that trilogy, it was the year that the dragon hatchlings were brought to the dragons via fairies. But in the Legend of Spyro, we don't even know if the concept of fairies bringing eggs to the dragons is a thing, and let alone if the dragons are specifically only born in that year. So, for the time being, in the Legend of Spyro timeline, I don't think I'm going to consider this a factor. Thing is about all of this, we don't really know, so we're going to honestly have to guess. Now, based on the theory that 10 generations equals to 1,000 years, a generation would last, as I stated, 100 years on average. Here's the math showing you what I mean if you wanted to see that as well. I'm going to explain this the best way I can and see how exactly this would pan out if the idea were true, and then we'll bring up our own conclusion. So, Spyro and Cinder's designs are roughly the same size they were in The Eternal Night in comparison to others like the Guardians, but they seem to have matured a little bit, for instance, their wings becoming more suitable for some level of flight. So I think that their adulthood would be sometime a bit later than human, given their size and age. They are the only young dragons that we can go off of, so the ideal situation of knowing everything about how dragons mature in the Legend of Spyro is not granted to us. Since they seem to age actually slower than human, we can't really even compare them to most reptiles, as most reptiles age faster and have shorter generations than that of a human, let alone a Legend of Spyro dragon. The only reptile that I know that actually beats a human is a tortoise, as they have around 40 years before they reach maturity and or parenthood, or at least the capacity to be a parent, and live about 150 to 200 years. But as you're going to see, the Legend of Spyro dragons can apparently blow that out of the water. So, in the case of ages, if it'll help at all, do we know how long a dragon can live in the Legend of Spyro? Well, sort of. So, in The Eternal Night, you meet an individual known as the Chronicler, a record keeper of all dragon history. He implies that he is perhaps over 1,000 years old, but the only caveat to that is that he might be kept alive by some sort of magic, so we don't really know the natural lifespan of a dragon, but we're going to maybe go on maybe less than 1,000 years, somewhere around higher hundreds. Okay, so what about more non-canon sources like the Jared Polin headcanon? It is actually in here that we have the idea of more solid ages, at least for the Guardians, and another confirmation that the Chronicler is over 1,000 years old. Now, I will warn you, as I do most of the time, when you read Jared Polin headcanon, don't take it as actual canon. It's just something I put in these videos for fun and because they have some interesting insights into the Legend of Spyro, but these are not officially canon unless stated by companies. But with that knowledge, we'll be going into non-canon sources to try to explain this. In an interview hosted by Dragon of Ice and Fire, Jared Polin was asked this. This is bouncing off another question regarding Corrupted Cinder being an accurate representation of an adult female dragon in the Legend of Spyro universe. But wow, you caught me completely off guard with saying Malefor may have been Spyro's father. Definitely an interesting idea. However, it never crossed my mind really, since there were supposedly 10 generations between Spyro and Malefor, and I had assumed that Malefor was imprisoned in convexity long enough for him not to age and thus be able to meet Spyro in the first place. That said, Dawn of the Dragon didn't include any info about how Malefor was imprisoned and what he really did to be exiled, so everything about him is still pretty cloudy. And in the cutscene image from the Eternal Night where Malefor was depicted young, there was a character in the foreground with a strong resemblance to the Chronicler, and the Chronicler implied he had been at the White Isle for over 1,000 years. So, how Malefor lived so long is still a mystery, unless all dragons in general could live so long. Here's Jared Polin's answer. Fun fact about dragon eggs in the Spyro universe. They can take decades to hatch. Longer even. If the time isn't right, they'll incubate safely until a timely opportunity presents itself. The rationale behind Malefor potentially being Spyro's father was plausible, but only if Spyro's egg lay dormant for a good while. We reasoned that perhaps Spyro's egg was laid a very long time ago, while Malefor was still free and kicking around. Then it lay still through the time of turmoil and upheaval, and right through the Dragon Purges until Ignitus released it down the river in a new beginning. It was waiting for destiny to find the time of hatching. Of course, this was never fleshed out, and most of the team preferred Ignitus as Spyro's father. Rumor had it that there were unhatched eggs still out there, just waiting for their time, but we never got to the design phase to flesh out that subsequent plot and hatchling characters. I'd love to do that one day. Also, dragons are long-lived in Spyro's world, and originally I'd intended Ignitus to be around 250 years old young at the time of New Beginning. The Chronicler, however, would be very ancient indeed, over 1,000 years old for certain, possibly over 2,000. Oh, and yes, that is him with young apprentice Malefor. Okay, I'm going to unpack a little bit about that, but maybe we'll go into other details about that whole answer later in another video. That's a lot. So, if we go by this, yes, the Chronicler could be thousands of years old, and the Guardians are around 250 years old. They seem to be relatively good at taking care of themselves and prove that they are strong, not weak and frail. According to this, maybe 250 years is actually young for a dragon. So it could be very well true that the dragon starts to slow down after a few centuries. So that's their age. But when they approach adulthood, it seems to be sometime before the Guardians' age, as they seem to be well-seasoned adults by the time that we see them. So I imagine their adulthood and maturity has, well, passed. Because of their slower growth, I think it's safe to say that yes, 100 years could work. Give or take a few, that would make 10 generations every 1,000 years at a minimum. But I don't think that's the final result that we can have. It also could be any number of years between the age of the Guardians and the age of Spyro that they can reach adulthood. Thing is, 100 years is a very long time. And generally speaking, the dragon race might not even be able to keep existing if generations were that long. So I do want to go back to a point I made. The tortoise, even if it doesn't look like a dragon at all, with its 40 years. This would speed up the process of a generation and give the dragons in nature, a chance to, well, actually continue to exist and keep the species alive. But there is one thing that could help it get to 100 years if need be, which is something else that Jared Polin mentioned. According to Jared Polin headcanon, and if there was any sort of conflict that might harm them or the occupant, They just won't hatch. This could, at least in Spyro's case, like it says here, mean that the time between his egg being laid and when he hatched could have been any number of years before a new beginning. So, depending on the current situation of the world, a generation could be any number of years. And the entire definition is just thrown out the window because that just makes sense. It also could be that the interpretation of 100 years was sort of skewed because while a dragon could get to adulthood by 40 or 50, eggs just wouldn't hatch for decades after that, and the average might have been maybe 80 to 100 years. That might have just been an assumption based on what the current factors of the world were at the time. And especially during Malefor's war, I imagine that eggs would want to keep themselves relatively safe and the occupant that is in them. So that might have even stretched generations out. It doesn't really seem to be up to the dragons if this headcanon is true. So, again, it could be any number of years. There's not an actual specified amount. So, perhaps one is right, maybe both are wrong, or both are right. I honestly don't really know, and that's kind of why I like covering the Legend of Spyro. Now, there are some things in this that make me want to make an entire talk on what an age is instead of what a generation is, but I'll be covering that another time. But for now, that's what I have on the entire idea of generations. What do you all think? Let me know your thoughts, and what exactly you think that this could all mean. And to end this off, I want to thank Abyssal Blue, Echo Restored, and Starry Skies for the red gems, and Kiasu Shin for the blue gem, and the support for the channel. Thank you all so much. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next lore or speculation talk. Stay safe, historians.